the foundation principle of the universe is love. But love is a mushy term. And I think the most helpful way to express divine love is other-centeredness. That we serve a God whose chief interest is not his own welfare, but the welfare of the creatures that he has made. Other-centeredness. And God would be inviting Lucifer to give up some of his status, if necessary, so that God's new creation of human beings could succeed. And at some point, Lucifer began to say, no, I'm losing ground here. I'm being replaced by this new race of creatures. And jealousy would begin to come in and be at the root of his questions and ultimately opposition to God.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Božidar Prgonić, and I'm honored to speak with one of the biggest names for the Book of Revelation in contemporary theology, Professor John Paulien from Loma Linda University. Professor John, thank you very much for your time.
Good to be here with you.
These days you will present one paper on topic, the identity of Michael in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. And this topic intrigued Christianity for almost 2,000 years. And especially this text in Revelation chapter 12 said that there is conflict between Michael and Satan and their angels. Could you please tell us a little bit about context of this great war that is explained in Revelation chapter 12?
When you look at Revelation 12, the language of war is used, military language. But in actual fact, when you peel away the surface, you realize it's a particular kind of war. It's a war of words. In fact, in the English language, the Greek word polemic actually is more of a, using words in conflict rather than physical battles and things like that. So while the language of war is used in chapter 12, it's really talking about a conversation. And the question is, what is the conversation all about? What is the argument, shall we say, all about? And the argument has to do with the character of God. Is God trustworthy? Is God kind and gracious, or is he angry, unforgiving, and spiteful? As we understand what the scriptures teach about this conflict, back at the beginning, when Lucifer, who became Satan or the devil, began to question the character of God. That's how it all started. And so he questioned the character of God, began to share his questions with other angels. Many chose to join him in raising questions. And the whole problem with a war of words is you can't settle it by snapping your fingers. If it's one person's word against another person's word, the truth can only come out by demonstration. In other words, one party has to demonstrate that what they're being accused of is not true. And demonstration can take a long time and a lot of different contexts in order to establish. And so, in my understanding at least, one reason that tragedy and evil and sin continue in this world year after year is we're in the difficult process of convincing a universe that God's way is truly superior to Satan's, that God's character has been dragged through the mud, slandered by Satan, and proving that someone else has slandered you can be a difficult task. And that's the task that God is facing with very, very intelligent beings. Lucifer himself being perhaps the most intelligent created being that was ever made.
Yeah, in this text, we cannot see that this is Archangel Michael, but just a book before in Judah, we can see that this is Archangel Michael. What is different between angel and archangel?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think it even says that Michael's an angel in chapter 12 of Revelation. So it says Michael fought with his angels, etc. an archangel would be a ruler of the angels. The Greek word arche can mean a ruler, like monarch is you're being ruled by one person. Patriarch, you're being ruled by the father. Matriarch, ruled by the mother. So the Greek word for rule is in the arch of the archangel. So the archangel is the ruler over the angels. Now, in Jewish tradition, some traditions had 4 archangels, others had 7. So you have the possibility that the rulers of the angels might be multiple in number, perhaps like a cabinet or a board over the much larger body. But in the book of Jude in the New Testament, Michael is specifically called the archangel, the ruler of the angels. In Revelation 12, it is simply Michael who is fighting with angels. He's the commander of the angels, so it's the same thing, even if you don't say it. Yeah.
Can you see any opposition between Michael and Satan? Are they fighting each other, or Michael is just representing God?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question. The book of Revelation doesn't directly address that. It simply says there was war in heaven. On one side was Michael and his angels. On the other side was Satan and his angels. It was a war of words. And in that war of words, apparently, Michael was able to convince much of the heavenly universe that God is trustworthy, that Satan is a liar, etc. And so there was no place found for them in heaven anymore. In other words, they lost their credibility. And so there's no point in pursuing an argument when nobody's listening. So whether Satan was thrown out of heaven or simply said, I'm done with this, it is clear that heaven no longer had to deal with Satan after this battle.
Yeah, some Christians believe that Michael is actually Jesus Christ. What is the strongest argument for that?
All right. Well, one of the strongest arguments is in the book of Jude, as you mentioned. Michael is called the archangel. In Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the archangel is present at the return of Jesus. When Jesus returns to earth at the end of history, he comes with the voice of the archangel. Now, it doesn't say Michael there, but the only 2 references to archangel in the entire New Testament are Jude, where it's Michael the archangel, and then here in 1 Thessalonians 4, you have the voice of the archangel. And so I think while it's not explicit, nowhere in the Bible does it say Michael is Jesus. In 1 Thessalonians 4, the question is, if that voice of the archangel isn't Jesus' voice, why is it mentioned there at that point?
Could we assume that Jesus Christ, in that moment of second coming, he would appear in the form of archangel?
Well, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. Will he come looking like a human being or come looking like an angel? I can't answer that, but I think the usage of Son of Man in regard to Jesus at the second coming would suggest that he comes in a human form, one that we can look at and say, okay, I recognize who this is, and this is what we've been looking forward to. So he would probably appear the way most people would expect Jesus to look. Whether he actually looked like that when he was here on this earth or not, but he would meet the people where they are, I think. But if Jesus is equated with Michael, then he could be human or he could be archangel as is needed by the situation.
How Michael is presented in Old Testament?
Well, the main part is in the book of Daniel, and there Michael appears in the story, and like in Revelation 12, it's a story of conflict with Satan. So you have a situation where the people of God are captive in Babylon, but the Babylonians have been overthrown by a new ruler. And that ruler is Cyrus, the Persian king, very famous in history outside the Bible as well as in the Bible. And Cyrus the Persian comes, and it seems that one of his policies was to overturn all the political prisoners. When he conquered Babylon, he would allow the political prisoners to go home. So the people of various religions that were captive in Babylon would be allowed to go back to their homelands, would be allowed to begin practicing their religion again. And that fits with the biblical accounts where Cyrus gives the Jews permission to go back home, permission to reestablish their worship, permission to start rebuilding the temple, etc. So Cyrus is the great liberator and perhaps the first practitioner of religious liberty in the world. So at this moment, when Cyrus is just coming into view, Daniel 10 portrays a situation where there's a conflict in Cyrus's mind. In other words, Cyrus is debating perhaps whether to act on this policy and whether specifically to act on it in relation to the Jews, which had perhaps often been seen in the past as troublemakers within that part of the world. No doubt there were some advisors that said, not so sure whether you should do this in their case, or maybe just in general. It was such a new and radical policy. So Cyrus is wrestling, and Daniel is praying for Cyrus. And according to the story, Michael is a powerful figure, a heavenly figure that is called in to battle with Satan and over Cyrus's mind. You see, this fits with the idea of a war of words because it's a war. The decisions that Cyrus makes have implications for the much larger conflict. And so bringing Michael in was like bringing in reinforcements when a battle's kind of 50-50. And Michael is a decisive player who ends up persuading Cyrus to let God's people go, let them go back home, let them reestablish their worship, etc. But it's portrayed as a spiritual battle between Michael and Satan. And the language of Revelation 12 actually echoes the Greek of one of the translations of Hebrew into the Old Testament. Theodotion, it's called, was a particular Greek version. And in that Greek word version, there's an awkward sentence there about doing battle that is echoed in Revelation 12, a very awkward expression in the Greek language. So the connection in the mind of John, the author of Revelation, with Daniel 10, I think is pretty clear. John is dependent on that to say there's war in heaven and there's also war on earth. It's a universal conflict, and it's a war of words. It's a battle over the minds of human beings. Which side will you be on? Do you accept the claims of Satan and operate accordingly? Or do you instead accept the claims of God and see the evidence that God is truly gracious and merciful, long-suffering, etc.? And by the way, let me just add, I think how one approaches this battle, regardless of your religious background, how one approaches this battle is kind of crucial for our spiritual health, because it seems to be a principle that you become like the God you worship. If the God you worship is vengeful, is unforgiving, is severe, you become more and more like that. If the God you worship is merciful, compassionate, gracious, loving, forgiving, etc., if that's the kind of God you worship, you become more and more like that. And I think we can see that as we look around the world today, that pictures of God deeply impact the way people behave. People can condone the most horrific actions if they're done in the name of God. And if that's the kind of God you worship, then you become like that. So the picture we have of God, this cosmic conflict over the character of God, is really critical to spiritual health. Because if we have a picture of God that's very, very different from the cruel and unforgiving picture that seems to be behind some of the actions in today's world, God wants us to clean things up, to get rid of all these blasphemers, etc. It's a very logical case to make. You want to defend God. You want God to win. Then the question is, if God is God, does he need us to win? Does he need us to do cruel acts? Could he not snap his finger? If he chooses to let someone live, what right do I have to take that life away? You see, so the picture you have of God, if God is vengeful, just can't wait to wipe out all those bad people out there, then you'll want to jump in and help out. But if you see God as deeply in love with every human being, regardless of their background, regardless of their religion, God is deeply in love with them, that'll affect the way we treat them. And it may be very, very difficult, especially if we're a captive or being tortured or something like that, to treat other people the way God treats them is a difficult but real consequence of following the God of the scriptures, at least, I believe.
It is clear that Lucifer wanted to take a place of God. So if you look through this context, it seems that Michael is Jesus Christ, incarnated God. But in the same time, in chapter 10, we can see that it's mentioned that one of the chief princes. In the same time, in New Testament, Jesus is mentioned as a unique one, monogenes. So how we can answer for that text that he is one of, not the only one, or unique or specific above others?
I think the honest answer is that the Bible does not settle the question. There is no particular biblical text that equates Michael with Jesus Christ. All right? No specific biblical text does that. You do have implications. And one of these implications is the connection between Jude and 1 Thessalonians. Michael, the name Michael isn't given there. Michael isn't equated with Jesus Christ. But both of them are involved in raising the dead. Both of them are involved in the conflict with Satan, for example. There's some very, very strong parallels between Michael and Jesus Christ. So I do think that one can make a strong case of equating Michael and Jesus Christ. At the same time, the Bible isn't explicit on that, so I can understand somebody saying, look, angels are angels, and Jesus Christ is Jesus Christ. Angels are created beings. Jesus Christ, according to Revelation, is worthy of worship. On the other hand, angels refuse to accept worship in that same book. So how can an angel be an object of worship if it's merely a creature, you see? And so that comes back to the Christian perspective, I think. And the Christian perspective is that God chose, as part of this cosmic conflict, to demonstrate his character in an unmistakable way through Jesus, the Messiah. That's what Jesus Christ means, by the way. Christ is a Greek equivalent of Messiah. So God chose to reveal himself in human form, because that's the best way we could understand God. It's kind of hard to understand God being out there, but God could demonstrate what he is like. And this is where the character of God comes in so strongly. In the Gospel of John, there's a special occasion. The disciples are getting together with Jesus just before the Passion Week, and it's their last supper together, as so many have called it. And as he's approaching this Last Supper, there's an issue. And the issue is that the disciples have wandered some distance, and it's a tradition that when you enter somebody's home for a special event, that person provide a slave to wash the feet. Because I mean, everybody bathes before going to a banquet, right? But if you're walking in sandals on dusty roads, your feet are going to get dirty, even though the rest of you may still be clean. And so the tradition is that a slave should meet everybody at the door, wash their feet, and then they come in to the feast totally clean. The problem is, disciples get together and there's no slave. There's nobody there to do the task. And you can imagine them looking at each other, not me. No, not me. Nope. I'd rather sit here with dirty, stinky feet than get up and wash anybody else's. All right. And while they're all stewing there, suddenly Jesus, the head, gets up and begins to wash their feet. Now, that's the story everybody knows. But what is often overlooked is verse 3 of chapter 13, where it says, Jesus, knowing who he was, knowing where he came from, knowing where he was going, took off his outer garment, got a basin of water, and began to wash the disciples' feet. In other words, from the Christian perspective, if Jesus was God in the flesh, he knows that. He knows who he is. He knows where he came from. And this is a deliberate act to show his disciples what God is really like. Not just Jesus, an exalted human being, but God is like this. And in case you don't get the message, in the very next chapter, Jesus says to one of his disciples, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And the term Father, of course, in the Christian context is an expression of the great God of heaven, the God of the scriptures, the God that all worship, the one God, you see. So if Jesus has come in the flesh to show us what that God is like, then if the Father had come down, taken human flesh, and walked among us, he would be no different than Jesus was. That's the claim that you have in the Gospel of John. And so the question is then, if God can take on humanity in order to show what God is like, would it be any different for God to take on the form of an angel in order to show the angels what God is like, back in eternity past? So I don't see a problem with the idea of a godlike figure being portrayed as an angel once you've gotten over the hump of a godlike figure being portrayed as a human being. I don't think the jump there is very big. And if you go back to the book of Genesis at the very beginning of the Bible, it says that Yahweh, the name of the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh and two angels came to visit Abraham in the middle of the day outside his tent, and they've come to investigate Sodom and to see what's going on over there. And here you have Yahweh represented as a man. All three of them are called men. 3 men came to Abraham. So the great God and 2 mighty angels are all portrayed as men. So how God meets people seems to be in view here. And so I personally don't see a challenge in seeing Michael as an equivalent of Jesus Christ, because in fact God is well capable of appearing in human form, and angelic form would not be a challenge in relation to that.
Yes, I want to say that actually God, as he wanted to get closer to human through Jesus Christ, he wanted to get closer to angels through
Right.
Michael.
And that actually helps with another issue, because people have often wondered, how on earth could Lucifer, the angel that became Satan, get so twisted around? Is there something wrong with his software? Was God perhaps, is there a flaw built in to the system? And that was Lucifer. And the scriptural answer is no. God is not responsible for Lucifer. God gave him freedom, God gave him intellect, etc. But Lucifer got twisted on his own. And how could that have happened? I don't have an answer. But it does make sense to me that if the second person of the Godhead came among the angels as the mightiest of the angels, and by the way, Michael is often termed as the chief of all the angels, the chief even of the archangels in Judaism, as well as in the way he's portrayed in the New Testament. If God has truly come down in angelic form, then for Jesus to be welcome within the consultations of the Godhead, and Lucifer not, could become a source of jealousy. Now, the foundation principle of the universe is love, but love is a mushy term. And I think the most helpful way to express divine love is other-centeredness. That we serve a God whose chief interest is not his own welfare, but the welfare of the creatures that he has made. Other-centeredness. And God would be inviting Lucifer to give up some of his status, if necessary, so that God's new creation of human beings could succeed. And at some point, Lucifer began to say, no, I'm losing ground here. I'm being replaced by this new race of creatures. And jealousy would begin to come in and be at the root of his questions and ultimately opposition to God. So that's a theory. That's not something explicit in the text. But in the Bible, in the book of Hebrews, there's a statement in chapter 2 that says human beings were created for a while lower than the angels, but that at one point they would receive a position similar to that of Jesus in dominion over the universe. In other words, God puts the universe under human control. That's a stunning statement, you see. And if Satan Lucifer caught least wind of that, to realize that up until now, I've been, major domo, I've been number one. And now God is creating a race of beings more like him, the image of God, than any other creature has ever been. More like God than any other creature. I could see Satan mulling that over and allowing some jealousy to creep in, rather than focusing on the other-centered love that was wired into his being. He began to shift to a self-centered love, and that's the root of all conflict that we have in the universe and the world today, is people who prioritize their own interests over the interests of others. And the God we see reflected in Jesus' behavior is a God who puts others ahead of himself. And that's almost unimaginable. I don't think human beings would have come up with that idea. This is something only God could think of.
Does an archangel have the power to resurrect? As we can see that Michael is mentioned in the context of resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he is associated with resurrection at several points. That would Certainly, we know that in the New Testament context, Jesus is the author of resurrection. God is the author of resurrection. And so ultimately, that's something only a God could do. That makes it, in my mind, more likely that Michael is equated with Jesus Christ. If Michael is simply an angel, not God, an angelic being. If Michael is simply an angel among other angels, even the greatest of the angels, the power to resurrect would not seem to make sense in that context. So, equating Michael with Jesus, who clearly has the power to resurrect, would be, I think, it would be an argument, at least in favor of equating the two.
What are the main arguments of Christians that believe that Michael is just one of the very high angel, but not creator himself?
Yeah. Well, the biggest argument is simply that he is an angel and Jesus is not. You see, so how can an angel be worthy of worship? How can an angel create? How can an angel resurrect the dead? So the two are distinct and should not be equated. Since the Bible doesn't explicitly equate them, that is a view that I respect, and those Christians who follow with that. I think the biggest argument, though, for Christians is that it might diminish the deity of Jesus Christ. The fear is if we allow him to be an angel, then he must be inferior to the Father, to the great God, etc. So there's a sense that seeing Michael as Jesus Christ cheapens the role of Jesus Christ rather than enhances it. And I understand that argument from a Christian perspective. It's a powerful one. At the same time, as I mentioned, we see God coming in human form back in the book of Genesis. We see the Messiah within Judaism is often portrayed as an angelic figure. So angel language can be applied to Messiah within Judaism already. So applying angel language to Jesus would not be a surprise in a context where the philosophy of Judaism plays a strong role.
The Jews believe that Michael is equal Messiah.
Not all, no. I mean, the evidence is somewhat mixed. When you go to, for the sake of our audience, we have the Hebrew Bible, which was the Bible of the Jews, which was inherited by Christians, respected by Muslims. You have the Greek Bible, the New Testament, which is accepted by Christians, respected by Muslims, generally treated with some suspicion by Jewish people. So you have these witnesses to what God is doing in both contexts. And I think I'm just lost the point. Do you remind me your question?
Yeah, did Jewish people equalize Messiah and Michael?
Yeah. So when you go outside of these Old and New Testaments, Greek Bible, Hebrew Bible, outside of them are many Jewish books. Some are called Apocrypha, which means hidden books. And these were books written between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you have a number of books there, like Fourth Ezra, Tobit, additions to Daniel, Maccabees, etc. All right. So you have a number of books written in Greek, which is why they probably weren't accepted into the Hebrew Bible because of different language. But they're Jewish works written in Greek, thought to be valuable, but not equal with Scripture. All right. In those books, some of those witnesses equate the Messiah as an angel. Others either just don't mention it or think otherwise. So the evidence is mixed, but certainly some Jews saw angelic features in the Messiah, and Christians did not need to shy away from it for that reason.
The Jews believe that Messiah will be incarnated God, or
Not
just
that I'm aware of. Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I think that was probably a surprise, even to the disciples of Jesus. Because and this is a problem that God has. If you allow for God the idea of coming down in human form, okay, it makes sense that God would do that to communicate his character to human beings. Obviously, understanding what God is like would come easiest for us from someone who looks like us, talks like us, speaks our language, gestures and everything are familiar to us. The problem is this: the moment that God comes down in human flesh, it now raises questions who this human being is. If you imagine Jesus and the disciples walking down a dusty road on a very, very hot day, and their feet are getting dirty, they're getting dirty almost from head to toe, and suddenly a breeze comes in just the right direction, and you smell body odor from Jesus, your exalted leader. At that moment, would you be likely to say, oh, this must be God? Probably not. You see, the very humanness might cause you to doubt that this person was from God. The divine nature, of course, is essential to truly communicate what God is like in clear and unmistakable terms. So that's the dilemma. The best way, I mean, God used prophets, etc., but the best way to communicate what God's character truly is like would be to do so in a context visually and otherwise that everybody can understand. But the moment you do that, it's challenging for people engaging that human being to truly grasp that he's more than just a human being. And you can see the disciples struggling with that as you go through the Gospels to figure it out. What is it that convinced the disciples ultimately? I would say more than anything else is the godlike characteristics of Jesus, and the most prominent one is being able to read minds. Uh, that's something the rabbis clearly taught only God can do. And now you have a human being among us that can read your mind. Says, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking only God can forgive sins. Well, let me show you something. Can you do this? And he raises a crippled man up from his bed. So miracles, striking miracles, were evidence that God was at work. But there were prophets had done miracles in the past. It was this reading of minds. Nicodemus comes to him and Jesus says, you must be born again. And Nicodemus is like, what? What are you talking about? Jesus knows who this is coming to him. He knows what he's thinking, and he hits the key point right from the start, knowing going in what is going on there. So the ability to read minds, I think, was perhaps the strongest convincer. The Samaritan woman, she's not convinced who this guy is, and suddenly he says, you've had 5 husbands, and right now you're living with someone who's not your husband. She knows he's not been in that town before. She's saying, he's telling me everything I ever did. This must be the Messiah. Beyond that, you have the resurrection. If Jesus truly died, and if he was truly raised from the dead, that resurrection is God's validation of Jesus' teaching and ministry. And among Jesus' teaching and ministries is talking to his Father, like they were on the same level. I and the Father are one. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus doesn't say, whoa, I'm just a human being like you. No, he accepts that. When he's raised from the dead, a divine act, it's God placing his approval on Jesus' life and on his teachings, including the sense that he's truly part of the one God, and therefore needs to be treated as such. So it was a challenging path because the disciples were Jews as well. And it took them some time to really grasp that. But once they were convinced that Jesus was truly God come in the flesh, it changed everything. And that is, for better or for worse, at the root of what it means to be a Christian, is to acknowledge that God came in a unique form in order to show us what he is like. And not only that, in order to do whatever it takes to save us. And only God can save. So if Jesus' acts are salvific acts, then truly God is at work in Jesus. So if you take Jesus at face value and God approves of his ministry, then he must be much more than just a human being. And that's at the core of the claim of Christianity.
Could we fall into same trap as Jewish people? We are laughing at them because it was challenging for them to accept Jesus Christ as a God.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have a problem to accept Archangel Michael as a God because we think this is underestimating of God.
Yeah. Yes. That's correct.
And for the end, my final question would be, this Friday you will present in front of the greatest name in today's theology, this topic about Archangel Michael. What is your main or the biggest argument that Michael is Jesus Christ?
Up until this moment, most of what we've talked about is common in the discussion among students of the Bible, both Hebrew and Greek Bibles. Who is Michael? Is he equated with Jesus? Is he separate, distinct, is simply an angelic figure? Those debates have been going on for, as you mentioned at the beginning, hundreds, thousands of years among Jews, among Christians, etc. So that part is nothing new. What I'm contributing this Friday is the realization that there is a literary dynamic going on in Revelation 12. In the book of Revelation, whenever a new character is introduced into the vision, it's almost like the author presses a pause button, on a recording device and says, okay, before we continue the vision, let me give you a visual description and a backstory of who this new character is. So a new character appears, visual description, backstory, and then the vision can continue, and that character, who is now known to the readers, can function within the story. It's a pattern that's repeated many times in Revelation. What I noticed is that in chapter 12, the same pattern is happening. You have a woman introduced, the first character, and he gives a visual description. She's standing on the moon. She's got this stars around her head, shining like the sun, etc. So you have a visual description followed by a backstory. She's pregnant and she's about to give birth. Right? That's necessary to understand verse 5. So you get visual description, backstory. New character comes, the dragon, in verse 3. You get a visual description. 7 heads, 10 horns, tail that drags down stars out of heaven. So you have a visual description, but then you have the backstory, of the war in heaven, etc., that took place back before. So you have new character appears, visual description, backstory. Now the vision can move forward. In verse 5, another new character appears, a male child. And the male child would clearly seem to be Jesus because it emphasizes 3 things: his birth, his ascension to heaven, and his ultimate rule over the world. All of those fit in Revelation. This is Jesus. But here's the interesting thing. The male child appears in verse 5 and disappears from the story, is never seen again. The last part of the story is the male child ascends to heaven. And the dragon, it seems, follows him because the next part of the story is war breaks out in heaven between the dragon, who is threatening the male child, and Michael. Now, the male child has no visual and no backstory. Why is that the case? Because he was in the story before. He was the Son of Man in chapter 1. He was the Lamb in chapter 5. He's Jesus Christ in chapter 12, verse 10. So Jesus is portrayed by a number of different symbols, a number of different expressions. So the assumption is that the male child must be Jesus Christ, and he has no backstory because none is needed. Then appears Michael. Definitely a new character. The name doesn't appear before, yet there's no visual description. There's no backstory. He appears out of nowhere, and people have puzzled for centuries with that. I argue that the reason he appears out of nowhere is because he would be recognized as having been in the story before, that the recipients of the book of Revelation would have known that Michael is Jesus Christ. And therefore, when the male child gets to heaven, he's now manifest as Michael, continuing to battle with the dragon until Jesus Christ says victory and casts him out of heaven. So to me, that's a powerful argument, not a slam dunk. You know, I mean, there's room for a question because the Bible doesn't make the connection in so many words. But it's a strong argument, I think, that the Michael of Revelation 12 is understood by John and by his audience as Jesus Christ. That's my little contribution to this study. Yeah.
Professor John, thank you very much for your time. I really enjoy, and I'm sure that people who are watching my podcast would enjoy as well. God bless you.
Thank you very much. It was great to be with you.